Hello, everyone. My name's Christian Reilly, and I'm the co-host of the MMT podcast. And on behalf of the organizers of the Second International European MMT Conference, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, our audience from around the world. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on unions and demand policy. And to maximize time for the discussion, I'll only briefly introduce our panelists. Their biographies are more extensive than these introductions, so please forgive my brevity. But on this panel, we have economist Friederike Spiecker, economist and author Friederike Spiecker. We also have Oliver Picek, who is senior economist at Austria's Momentum Institute. And we have Australian economist and author of A Modern Framework for Thinking About Debt and Deficits, Lachlan McCall. So turning to the panel itself, perhaps outsiders or curious people, perhaps to these people, MMT can seem a little obsessed with technical details, but there's one detail that I think has an important bearing on this panel, and that is that the MMT view of the source of unemployment in countries with floating exchange rate currencies is the government, if the government in question is the currency issuer. So for people who are new to the topic, this is the chartalist view that the imposition of taxes causes citizens to need the state's currency, and therefore those citizens are in the first instance looking for work that pays in the currency but can't find it. Those people looking for work but can't yet find it are what we would technically define as unemployed. But the point of creating this unemployment is that the government can then spend its currency into existence to hire the unemployed it created with its tax for the further purpose of provisioning the public sector and the public purpose as determined by some hopefully democratic process. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that's the MMT framework. So I thought I'd now ask each panelist in turn if they're aligned with or sympathetic to that framework, or if they'd like to add anything in terms of opening remarks to set the context for the discussion. And I will turn to you first, Lachlan. Would you like to add anything?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It is a real honor. Christian, I've been a huge fan of the MMT podcast for some years now. You and Patricia, I think, have really done, you've created an incredible educational resource. I encountered modern monetary theory as very much a classically trained economist, and far and away the greatest educational resource I've had has been your podcast. I should begin by acknowledging it's 5:15 p.m. here in Canberra in Australia, and I should acknowledge I'm meeting with you all from the land of the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians and First Nations people of this land, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty over their land was never ceded. I broadly share the one monetary theory perspective. I will say I haven't studied the I think the anthropology of money and the origins of the anthropological case for the chartalist view is not something I've studied in enough detail to be a great expert, but it is, I think, easily one of the most interesting aspects of modern monetary theory, and I might leave it there.
Okay, so let's turn to you, Friederike, because there's some alignment perhaps, but maybe some extra things you'd like to add.
Yes, in my eyes, the source of unemployment lies in the inherent instability of a market economy. So this is one point we have to discuss where this instability stems from. And the mutual dependence of monetary and wage policy is what I think we should learn about. And there comes MMT, of course, into the play. And the main point I want to make is that we don't have a choice between wage growth and growth of employment. But if we see it the other way around, we need a special wage growth along the lines of the golden wage rule to have a chance to increase employment. So normally it's seen as the opposite. You can have either jobs or higher wages. And I think this is totally wrong to look at. And I hope we can discuss this point in the next hour.
Great. And can I just, for clarity, just ask you, what is that golden wage rule?
The golden wage rule means simply that wages should grow along the average productivity growth of an economy in midterm productivity growth, plus the inflation target of the central bank. So this is 2% in Europe, plus what we think will be the midterm productivity growth in, for example, in Germany.
Okay, thank you. And that's a great answer. And Oliver, turning to you, any opening remarks to set the framework?
Yeah, I think thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and talk with you all today. Yeah, I think I'd like to point out the huge contribution that MMT has made to the public discourse and how it's changed essentially the way we think and the way we talk about fiscal deficits, about unemployment, about how much the state can actually do to reduce unemployment. I think there's barely, I think, a more important force in the public discourse in the last years, or even the last decade, shifting our view and even shaping the view of mainstream economists in top-level departments, I would say. And I think what it has done is, if you look at, even say you look at blog posts of Paul Krugman with his influential New York Times column, where 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he was still talking about can we afford fiscal expansion? Can we afford to stabilize the economy in recessions? Shouldn't we, stop once the economy has recovered a little bit, but not enough, so that we've actually reduced unemployment to an acceptable level? We were already talking about reducing budget deficits. We need to watch out because otherwise the so-called bond vigilantes will come and they will drive up the interest rate on government debt, and we have to prevent that. So essentially, we had a view in our mind that had states and governments extremely constrained by financial markets. And MMT has said that's not true. At least for advanced economies that have their own currency, they've said no, that's not true. We print our own currency, so essentially we can afford everything we want. Of course, we need to afford the right things, and we don't. There's a limit somewhere, but essentially we can always fund a budget deficit in order to reduce unemployment. And that view, if you look at how the discussion is going this time around, right, the next crisis after the corona crisis versus after the financial crisis 10 years ago, then the discussion is completely different. And I think most central bankers and a lot of macroeconomists have accepted essentially the MMT view.
Okay, that's great. I just wanted to back up to something Friederike said about, the source of unemployment is the inherent instability of a market economy. I think I've said that correctly. Friederike, could you just expand on that a little bit, where that instability comes from?
Yes, I think the main point is we should think about the parallel behavior of private economic agents. So if we have a situation like the pandemic, like a crisis, stemming from outside the economy, everybody tries to save and tries to reduce their spendings and their costs just to prepare for the unsecure future. So if everybody acts like this, everybody's earnings and income goes down as well. So we have a self-reinforcing process. And from a microeconomic point of view, this is very rational. You can't ask somebody to spend more if he's anxious about the future. And if he learns that his earnings and income is decreasing. So what you actually need is a large or a great agent in the economy who's able to counteract this downward spiral. And this only can be the state. And I think this is the point MMT is making very good, because of course the state or the public has money enough to spend to bridge over such a crisis and to prevent that this self-reinforcing process it gets more speed. So you need a counteractor to break this parallel behavior between the private agents. And this is true not only for crisis which roots from outside the economy, but this is true also for the crises which are inside the economy. So the financial crisis, for example, in 2008, 2009, stemmed from the economy itself. So from a bad institutional arrangement and from the bad wages paid in the US and also in Europe. So the state has always the task to manage an economy so that it shouldn't get into booms and shouldn't get into recessions. And sometimes I think we forget that this is a task of the state and of economic policy at all. And we have different instruments to flatten these ups and downs of the economy. There are institutional instruments and there are operating possibilities of the state, like fiscal policy, but this is not the only instrument to work on that.
Okay, so I'm going to just turn to Lachlan for this to make the first point here. What Friederike is talking about, I hope I'm not going to misinterpret her, is the need for a counter-cyclical stabilizer, macroeconomic stabilizer, because of this instability that's inherent. And so MMT does have a suggestion about that. You could talk about that, or where you think the strengths and weaknesses of that is, and maybe just lay that out for us, Lachlan.
Sure. I should quickly just to reinforce what Friederike said. So I should say as well, in addition to being a public sector economist, I'm also an elected official with the Australian Community and Public Sector Union, the CPSU. I represent members from our equivalent of the Foreign Office or State Department, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I represent our union members on the National Governing Council of the CPSU. And one of the reasons that this is such the topic of this panel is so fascinating is because obviously, as anyone who's involved in heterodox economics, post-Keynesian economics, monetary theory, Marxian economics, knows we're in this this struggle with the orthodoxy at the moment. And one of the lines that the critics love to use that they think is hysterically funny, and which look, it might just be that as a queer person, I have a different standard for sarcasm and humor, but I feel as though someone needs to tell the orthodox economists that the triptych, it's not modern, it's not monetary, it's not a theory, it's not as staggeringly witty as they seem to think it is. But it's particularly galling when you consider, and I was reminded of it when Friederike was speaking. Mainstream new Keynesianism is not new, and it sure as hell isn't Keynesian. New Keynesianisms, besides the exhumation of the zombie that is general equilibrium modeling, the great contribution of new Keynesianism in the 90s was to say, well, the reason why labour markets don't clear during a downturn is because of nominal wage rigidities and sticky prices. That is to say, things like, for instance, union negotiated contracts, lock in certain levels of wages for a couple of years, whatever it might be. In Australia, we have the enterprise bargaining system, and that therefore in a downturn, wages aren't flexible enough to collapse, which would allow the neoclassical story of a self-clearing labour market to occur. Wages collapse until demand starts picking up again. Why doesn't that happen? The new Keynesians say, oh, well, it's because institutions like unions and various other bodies have sort of built in these nominal wage rigidities. The wage can't collapse because the unions negotiated some kind of contract or agreement that is insensitive to changes in the cycle. And the reason I think the sheer gall of these so-called new Keynesians to call themselves Keynesian. I mean, the sheer chutzpah, when Keynes's entire point was trying to figure out why is it that in highly flexible labor markets like the United States, the onset of a recession causing a collapse in labor demand, causing a collapse in labor prices, was not resulting in a self-correcting, self-clearing labor market. Why was it instead that the collapse, exactly as Friederike was alluding to, why is it that the collapse in wages during a recession, in the case of the Great Depression, why does it make unemployment worse when it should, according to neoclassical theory, it should make it better? Keynes's entire point was that wage flexibility is the thing that exacerbates, that enables that sort of snowballing effect of falling wages producing, exactly as Friederike was alluding to, falling wages resulting in falling employment rather than rising employment. And so for the so-called new Keynesians to call themselves Keynesians when their entire contribution to macroeconomic theory has been a refutation of everything Keynes was trying to do is galling. Anyway, I would say just a quick shout out to Bill Mitchell. Obviously, in my view, one of the greatest Australian economists my country's ever produced. Bill has said many times, including by a great book, a new book by Phil Armstrong called "Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference?" Bill makes the point then, as he did elsewhere, that he came to MMT through Marx because it was Marx's. Essentially, Bill argues that Keynes essentially sort of rediscovered Marx. Marx had already figured out that capitalism runs on sales, that capitalism is demand-driven, and Keynes has kind of rediscovered that. And there's both Bill Mitchell and Joan Robinson argued. Really, Kalecki's theory of effective demand is arguably better than Keynes's. Now, as far as the counter stability programs advocated by modern monetary theory, I've got to say, I've said this to a couple of my MMT colleagues, and I don't like it very much when I sort of say to them almost sort of tongue in cheek, you're a little bit fiscally conservative, aren't you? The book that sort of converted me to macroeconomics, I was an orthodox microeconomist. I was working in the microeconomic reform unit of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet here in Canberra, very neoclassical, that sort of thing, and had sort of absorbed the general view among orthodox economists that macroeconomics isn't all that interesting. And these days, when someone says that, I just say, no, your macroeconomics isn't all that interesting, which I shouldn't say because it's not very diplomatic, but it's true. The book that converted me to that was Bill Mitchell's first book, Full Employment Abandoned, Shifting Sands and Policy Failures, which I just think is an absolute masterpiece. It's brilliant, not least of all because in describing the rise of the Nehru, the collapse of the full employment regime in Australia, and giving a brilliant and highly technical but absolutely brilliant exposition of the case for the job guarantee program in MMT. It's not just technically brilliant. There's also this wonderful sort of undercurrent of anger to his prose, because he sees what has been done to unions, what has been done to working class people by these policies, by neoliberal policy. So essentially, the approach that modern monetary theorists take is we need to have a large automatic fiscal stabilizer, rather than relying on conventional. And this is sort of why I say MMT economists. There is a slight. We're not fiscally conservative, but we recognise that there. It was Milton Friedman who said that the problem with fiscal policy is discretionary fiscal policy is always going to be undermined by timing lags. That it's hard for politicians to be able to exactly calibrate the exact amount of fiscal stimulus needed and deliver it in exactly the right places at exactly the right time, without either undercooking it or overcooking. Undercooking in terms of leaving residual unemployment, or overcooking things and creating inflation, which is partly where the MMT emphasis on automatic stabilizers come from. Now, you could argue, and Claudia Sam, for instance, who's not an MMT economist, but I'd say sort of adjacent, brilliant macroeconomist in America, has done a lot of great work on the importance of automatic stabilizers. And obviously, unemployment benefits are a stabilizer. That's important too. But the point that we make, and I think it's a normative point, but it's one that needs to be made, is that, and I certainly make this as a unionist, is workers should have the choice. We have the ability to have an automatic stabilizer that delivers cash, or an automatic stabilizer that delivers jobs. And as a trade unionist, my job is to give my members more options and more choices. So we can have we should have a bigger welfare state. We should have larger automatic stabilizers in the form of unemployment benefits, but we can have a job guarantee too, and let workers decide for themselves what gives them greater agency. And it has the same macroeconomic stabilizing effect.
Mm-hmm. Great. So now we're bringing unions into this. I'm going to turn to you, Oliver, and the Eurozone's rate of unemployment, I'm told, is it has never fallen below 7%. And this is a broad question, take it wherever you like. Is this rate of unemployment acceptable for unions?
Well, obviously it's not acceptable for unions, and I don't think it should be acceptable for anybody else either, because it's a terribly high rate of unemployment. Obviously not as high as we've had in awful economic periods like the Great Recession. But if you look back to the 70s, in Austria, where I come from, or in Germany, where Friederike comes from, we've had essentially full employment for 2 decades in the 60s, 70s, early 80s. We've had unemployment rates of 1% in Austria there, right? And so having 7% across a really large area like the Eurozone is obviously way too high. Whether it should be 2% or 1% or 3% is a different matter, but 7% is obviously much too high. And so what are the and this is, I think, where we've gone wrong in economic thinking in the last 30, 40 years, is that this state of a high unemployment rate was accepted, right? It was rationalized. It was said there is something like a natural rate of unemployment that we can't go below, because if we do, if economic policy goes below that, if we try to stimulate demand through government spending or other or lower taxes, right, then what will happen is that inflation will rise. And that was kind of like the big scare. We can't go below that unemployment rate because otherwise inflation will rise. And I think here is also where MMT has changed a bit the view, because what's happening in the US right now, since actually already like 5 years or so, I would say, is that they essentially say, well, let's try it, right? Let's push against the boundaries. Let's push the boundaries back. Let's try to go as low as we can with unemployment. And in fact, it has not led to inflation well, now we have a different story with Corona, but with COVID, but they've tried this for the last years and it has actually worked, right? Unemployment has gone lower than they thought it could go. And I think we should try the same in the Eurozone. We will probably see that unemployment there can also go much lower than it is right now. But that has not happened yet in the Eurozone.
Okay, and just to, I'll just insert this, and then if I've mischaracterized any of this, you guys, you learned people can put me straight. But it seems to me that the broad brush Keynesian ideas from a few decades ago were the counter-cyclical stabilizer should be pump priming, which is injecting small amounts of fiscal stimulus, sitting back, seeing what happens, and hoping for the best. And whereas you've got the MMT is an automatic stabilizer, so that when people lose their jobs, they move into a buffer stock of employed labor rather than unemployed labor. So it doesn't require as Lachlan was laying out, it doesn't require politicians to get around the table and agree to things. We're just replacing one automatic stabilizer for another. So that's the MMT picture. But just so we get a sense of those of us who aren't in the Eurozone, just so we get a sense of what's going on there, Friederike, what's been the impact of this constant lack of demand in the Eurozone on real and nominal wage growth?
Yeah, this is just the problem I addressed in my statements before. So if the unemployment rate is high, the trade unions are weak because people are not willing to strike for higher wages because they fear to lose their jobs and to find themselves back on the bridge, under the bridge. So in Germany, the Agenda 2010 ruins or at least decreases the unemployment insurance, and this is still until today a large problem for the trade unions to fight for higher wages and for a wage growth along the lines of the golden wage rule I explained before. So of course, this unemployment rate in Europe is much too high. And the problem is if you look to the different countries, you see it's very different. In South European countries, the unemployment rate is much higher than, for example, in Germany or also in Austria. And this is a large problem because the Germans always say, okay, we did it right. We agreed to have only small wage growth rates. And look at our country, our unemployment rate is way under that of Spain or Greece or Italy, or even in comparison to France. So it looks like that Germany or the German trade unions and the German employers made everything right. And here, if you look deeper in it, you see it's the same process or the same problem I described between private economic agents. So the countries try to underprice each other, and Germany was very successful in doing that. And this is reflected in a high export, not a deficit, the opposite, export surplus, yes. So we exported our unemployment, and it looks for a simple-minded man, it looks like low wage growth is a good idea to lower the unemployment rate. But if you have a broader picture and the European picture, you see this is totally wrong. In countries which have their own currency, in the long run, the currency would appreciate if you have high international competitiveness. But within a currency union, this doesn't work. This doesn't happen. So Germany, one can perhaps say, sails in the shadow of the other European currency of the other currency union members, and this is very unfair. Especially if you look how the Germans act in Brussels or in the EU Commission. They always complain that the other countries make too large deficits. But this is just where we live from, yes? In our country, every sector, the household sector normally tries to save. The business sector started to save around 15 years ago. So they really changed their behavior, what they had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where they were the large sector making the deficit. So they stopped to do that. And now the German state says, we want to save also. We have this deficit rule, not only in the European Union, but also in our constitution. And we want to save. So we need deficit spending from outside. And that is what happened within the European, the currency union, the Euro Union. And this is very unfair, because we criticize the other countries for making the deficit we really need. Otherwise, we would end in a total recession. We would have ended there starting from 2010. So I think this is a great mistake how the whole system works in Europe.
And could you just tell us about the deficit rule that you just referred to? Is that a Eurozone? Are you talking about Eurozone-wide deficit rules, like the Stability and Growth Pact, or are there ones internal to Germany?
Yes, we have in Germany we have this Schuldenbremse, so the brake to make any deficit at all. So the federal state is allowed to make in normal times make a very small deficit, but actually all entities are told to pay public debts back. And this is what will happen, or what is already written down to do starting from 25, I think. They want to pay back those debts they now needed to finance or to bridge the corona pandemic. And this will be a fiscal contract in an enormous way, and will damage economic development, and it will prevent that we make something like the Green New Deal, yes? So this is kind of ridiculous. So this part of MMT telling don't pay debts back, yes, is very, very important. But you were kind of optimistic that this point of view spreads. Maybe in other countries, but I think in Germany there's a large part of voters and also of politicians who do not either understand or who do not want to change this view. So I'm not very optimistic whether we will come over this very problematic fiscal constraint we will see in the next years.
Okay. So let's bring unions back into it, and I'm going to wander into this question, so forgive me if it sounds a little bit fragmented. So, most economic frameworks recognize that private sector firms aren't really incentivized by the rules of what I would broadly call capitalism to create full employment as actors in the economy, in that labor is a cost to business and generally a cost to be minimized. And so I'm thinking, why should unions aim at full employment? And I'll throw that one over to you, Lachlan. Sure. Can unions even target full employment?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a fantastic talk on it's on YouTube that Dr. Victor Quirk, a former PhD student of Bill Mitchell's, gave for the Modern Money Australia group. I think it was last year, or it might have been the year before. And Dr. Quirk is a labour market political sociologist rather than an economist. And he actually worked in the federal government's employment service provider for quite some time. And he makes the point that the union movement in the late 19th century was campaigning from the outset for full employment. And there was always a recognition. I mean, there's a recognition going all the way back to Marx that the maintenance of what Marx called the reserve army of the unemployed is in the interests of capital and the interests of employers, and not in the interests of workers and the interests of unions, because exactly as Friederike articulated earlier, unemployment weakens the bargaining power of unions and workers. Of course it does. There's demand is lower than supply. Of course it means that there's a downward pressure on wages in a sort of take it or leave it approach. And in Australia, the union movement from the beginning, and it's one of the reasons I found I have to say, the debate between not so much the debate between the universal basic income and the job guarantee, but the idea that the job guarantee debate sort of comes down to extremes in various camps, comes down to the welfare sector versus full employment, or the campaign for welfare and things like basic incomes and things like that, versus full employment and a job guarantee. It's just one of the stupidest things I think I've ever, and ahistorical and offensively ahistorical things I've ever seen, because certainly, at least in my country, one of the defining early moments in the birth of the union movement was a moment in the late 19th century when stonemasons building Melbourne University, my alma mater, down tools and marched, I believe, on state parliament in the campaign for a reduction in working hours in an 8-hour day. The union movement has always understood that we can simultaneously be overworked and underemployed. And traditionally, the union movement has always fought for a larger welfare state and more jobs and more leisure time. And so this recent sort of debate that says, the job guarantee is workist, or that it's fetishizing work and all this sort of stuff, or that, the expansion of full employment comes at the expense of a reasonable welfare state is just complete nonsense. As to the point about I suppose the bargaining power of workers and whether unions should be campaigning for full employment. The argument I always make to my union comrades is the target of I was going to say the NAIRU, but the NAIRU is it's a framework rather than a policy. The target of policies to deliberately create a pool of involuntarily unemployed labour. The target of those policies is not the unemployed. The target is you. The target is your union. The target is your union members. I mean, the proponents of those policies do not give a stuff about the unemployed. What they're trying to do is weaken your bargaining power as a union representative at the negotiating table. They are not actually trying to screw over the unemployed. They just don't really care. They're trying to actually snooker people with jobs, not those without them. And I'm reminded that there's the great line from Koleski's famous essay on the political economy of full employment, where he says, under the regime of a regime of true full employment, the SAC would cease to play its role as a disciplinary measure. The social position of the boss would be undermined, and the self-assurance and class consciousness of the working class would grow. Discipline in the factories and political stability are more appreciated than profits by business leaders. Their class instinct tells them that lasting full employment is unsound from their point of view, and that unemployment is an integral part of the normal capitalist system. So, I mean, I suppose the other historical point I make to Australian union leaders is we had, as I suppose the United States had, as the UK had, as a lot of Western countries had, we had a period in the post-war era where we had true full employment between 1945 and 1975. Unemployment averaged 2% in Australia. We haven't had true full employment in Australia since 1975. And that's been a policy of governments of both persuasions. And the other point I make to union leaders when I say why full employment and a job guarantee matters is that the policies that built that 30 years of full employment in Australia from 1945, in particular the full employment white paper of the Labor government of John Curtin, was built by the union movement. We built that. It's sort of part of our movement's legacy, and that era saw exactly as Friederike was alluding to earlier. We had a golden rule. We saw rising productivity. The union movement had enough bargaining power to ensure that the proceeds of that productivity growth was distributed to workers. That labour got its fair share relative to capital of those productivity gains. And that was an era. I mean, sure, there were a lot of other problems with that era, particularly relating to the treatment of LGBT people, women, people of colour. There were a lot of senses in which the post-war era was not some golden age. But in terms of macroeconomic policy, we had an era of rising living standards, 2% unemployment, and the strength of the union movement and what they built in the form of the 1945 Curtin Labor government full employment white paper was really the linchpin of all that. And so very rarely I come across a union leader who isn't persuaded by that argument. But when they are, I just say, for God's sakes, why would you not fight for our movement's legacy? We built an incredible era of prosperity, and we should be campaigning for its return.
Okay, all great points. I'm just noticing some questions coming in from the audience. They're great questions. So thank you for those, and welcome to the panel, those of you who are out there. And I'm going to just stick with you for a second, Lachlan, because this kind of it has bearing on something you brought up earlier, which is this is a question from The Brink. And I imagine that's not their given name at birth, but their screen name. The Brink. Hi, Brink. So he's agreeing with your idea about giving workers options, more options. That's something you talked about a few beats ago. So the Brink is saying, yes. So can we just have a UBI and a job guarantee? If we can marry the two ideas, we will greatly increase our pool of activists campaigning for this stuff. Do you have any thoughts on the interplay between the UBI and job guarantee ideas?
Yes, and if I weren't conscious of the professional context of this, I would take a dramatic sort of pause and sip from the glass of Chardonnay on my desk. Here's my view. I share the concerns that a lot of unionists, socialists, I mean, as in people on the left whose model of leftist politics is collectivist, because there are quite a lot of people who call themselves progressive or call themselves left-wing, but actually their politics are fundamentally individualist. They're fundamentally liberal. They just, I mean, they're classical liberals, but they're individualists, but they're just a bit more comfortable with gays and minorities than a lot of conservatives. So they identify as progressive, but their politics is not collectivism. It's not unionism. It's not socialism. It's individualism. And I share the critiques that both economic and political and philosophical that some of them that Bill Mitchell, Pavlina Chernova, Fadil Kaboub, a number of others have made. But I also just sort of think, look, in terms of the job guarantee movement, like, let's just pick our battles. This is not a battle we need to have. My sort of approach is, look, make peace with the UBI movement. Sure, we don't agree with them on a range of things. But I mean, this is sort of, there is an element of internecine sort of warfare among the political left that I think is sort of unnecessary. It's not a fight we need to have. And the other component of it is that I prefer, for instance, a guaranteed basic income rather than a universal basic income. I would prefer, for instance, essentially just having a really generous unemployment benefit that is essentially unconditional, as in we take away the work tests. If you find yourself unemployed, you are entitled to a very generous living income from the state, no questions asked. So a guaranteed basic income rather than sort of a universal basic income. And that's fine, because the UBI movement don't really know what they want either. So not to be sort of a bit snarky, but I mean, they don't, there is a lot of fragmentation within that movement as well to together build coalitions. Probably snarky remarks like mine just now don't help, but there is, I would point people to a great blog post by an Australian classical Keynesian economist, not an MMT, a classical Keynesian economist in Australia, Professor John Quiggin. He wrote a blog in 2018, and he proposed his own version of a job guarantee as early as 1994, separate from MMT. And the blog was called GMI plus JG equals paid work as a genuine choice for all, something like that. And the GMI being a guaranteed minimum income. And he makes the point that a combination of the two, of having unconditional cash if you want it, and unconditional employment if you prefer that, means that it does become a genuine choice. And the final point I would make is that I think it was the latest trial of a basic income from, I think, Finland, that found that labour participation rates were unaffected by the introduction of a basic income, which to me sort of says two things. First of all, it says that the anti-welfare arguments, the anti-passive welfare arguments, that if we just give people cash to survive on, everyone will just be a freeloader and no one will contribute. And I hate that language, but that's the language that's used. That's clearly incorrect, because the labour participation rate is unaffected by the introduction of unconditional cash. But at the same time, it also blows apart the argument of the UBI-only anti-JG group, who say, well, I don't want a job. I just want cash, and I don't really care what anybody else thinks. Well, it turns out, actually, if you give people cash, they have something to survive on, but they still want employment. They still look for employment. So it tells us that both the arguments that unconditional cash creates freeloading and the argument that cash alone is sufficient for most people, and that jobs are sort of superfluous, both of those arguments are wrong.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to turn to the other two panelists in a second about their views on job guarantee and universal basic income, and whether they can sit alongside each other or not. But also just inject this comment. I think it's fair enough to say there are lots of different UBI proposals out there. We're never talking about, the whole movement hasn't coalesced around one. Some people want a living wage UBI, some people don't, and there are lots of different flavors of UBI. But the one thing that unites them all is they call it UBI, universal basic income. And I think that's where people who kind of understand the macro have a problem, because they say, in trials of universal basic income, this positive outcome happened. They might try UBI in a region, and my response to that is that, well, that's not a trial of universal basic income. That basic income is limited by that geographical location, or it's limited by time. It's not a permanent basic income. It's not universal basic income. So I think a lot of universal basic income advocates very quickly reach for UBI when they really mean basic income. And that's probably more in line with what you were saying, Lachlan, about a basic income guarantee, because we're about, or the MMT view is about, we're trying to inject the demand precisely where it's needed, rather than everybody, and hopefully that will result in not inflation and a more just society. So yes, hopefully I haven't garbled that comment. But let me turn to you now, Oliver, and just get your thoughts on job guarantee and universal basic income, and where you are on that.
I think I can summarize it with one simple thought, right? Obviously everything that you're saying is correct, right? We've never really tried universal basic income, so we don't know whether it's going to work or not, right? But if you think about it in principle, in theory, then if you have a universal basic income, you get income, but you don't have to work for it. You don't have to contribute to production. And that could be inflationary, right? Everybody receiving money, spending it, but not necessarily contributing to the production of the goods that they want to consume. And so that's from a theory point of, or a macroeconomic theory point of view, that's the basic flaw in universal basic income that could or could not arise, right? If everybody still goes to work and engages in productive activity, and the production of the goods that need to be consumed, then it could work. But there is no guarantee in that. With the job guarantee, it's guaranteed that everybody who receives income from a job guarantee and with income the right to purchase goods, consumption goods, is also engaged in the production of goods in the economy or services in the economy, and therefore you receive income, but you also produce something, and that kind of like acts as a brake on inflation, because you're producing something and you're consuming something at the same time, which should be in theory less inflationary than if you just pay somebody money and they don't have to engage, or they cannot, or they're not allowed to engage if they're unemployed, for example, in the production of goods. And if you allow me, should I also answer to two questions of the audience?
Yes, please.
I'll take them with me in this pass. So Daniel Heim has asked two questions on the details of a job guarantee. So first question was, how do we prevent that the job guarantee is used as a low-wage sector that is dumping wages for other sectors, especially in countries like Germany and Austria? And that was indeed a debate that we had in Austria when we introduced our very, very small form of a pilot program. It's nowhere near a general job guarantee, right? The universal job guarantee. but it was a program limited to long-term unemployed, that they would essentially get a job if they were unemployed for more than a year and fulfilled some other criteria. And the question, there was a lot of discussion how to do it, right? Because the job guarantee that MMT advocates, and for good reasons, is one where you have a wage floor, you have a certain minimum wage standard that the job guarantee sets. In the US, that would be, for example, $15 an hour. It's different in every country. And then you set that as a basic wage floor and basic minimum working conditions floor to the economy that the private sector has to rise to, essentially, and a certain number of bad jobs that pay below this this wage would disappear. The problem there was that in Austria, obviously, even for a number of jobs that you would consider not well paid or jobs that are not very attractive jobs, we do have collective bargaining agreements. We have a collective bargaining coverage of 98%. So how do you prevent that from say if a local community offers let's say €15 an hour job, right? And that job as part of a job guarantee, and then you have, but actually the collective bargaining agreement would say you need to get paid 18. How do you solve this? And for this small program, it was actually what was actually done is that all the jobs in the program had to be paying the collective bargaining agreement wage, which isn't a lot anyways for most of these jobs, but it is actually higher than a job guarantee general wage. So that's how it was solved for this part. And I think for the long-term unemployment that don't really have many outside options, I think that's a solution that you can do. But you would have to think harder about whether that's a solution if you introduce a general job guarantee that anyone can take, even if they're not unemployed, or even if they're unemployed for a short time. Whether so that there are good reasons in MMT why you have this wage floor, so that you don't essentially outcompete all private sector jobs with your government mandated wage. So I'll keep it with that and give it back to you.
Okay, great points. And to me, it just emphasizes how important unions are going to be if, when the job guarantee ideas, the architecture of the job guarantee is so important. And I think, this is the concern of, say, Warren Mosler, one of the co-founders of MMT, that we don't want more and more jobs being swallowed up by the job guarantee, and competing wages down. It's supposed to be a smaller buffer of employed labor than the one we use at the moment, and we try not to overcomplicate it. It's so anyway, let me just turn to you, Friederike. Do you have thoughts on the job guarantee and UBI and how they might work together?
Yes, let me talk about the job guarantee first. I think we have to distinguish in which way the economy we talk about is working. If we have a very high specialization and very different qualifications of employees, I think the public job guarantee is quite complicated. So if we need public goods, this is more or less a structural question, how many public goods we want to have and we want the state to offer. And therefore we need very specialized people, let's say in the health sector, in the educational sector or whatever. So you can't get people in and outside just like the business cycle works. So I think this is not a good idea create jobs in the public sector, because you need the right people on the right place, as with the right qualification. So I would prefer to have a very good unemployment insurance, and to force the business sector or the employers to create jobs by good wages, by a good wage bargaining process, or a good outcome of this process, so that they have to invest. And as you see in every empirical work, if investment goes up, employment goes up as well. So the public sector is a very important sector in an economy, but not like a buffer, I think, to help in times of cyclical downturn. So I would say this is not the best way to fight unemployment. And what with regard to the UBI, I think the UBI is something to weaken trade unions. I agree with Oliver. What Oliver said, the problem of creating inflation by paying income without looking after the production, so that the people who get the income should produce something. This is a real problem. We have social transfers for very many occasions in what can happen in life if you get ill, if you have an accident or whatever. So for the normal case, you should produce something to get income, and therefore I would say the UBI is not a good instrument regarding inflation and regarding the strength of the trade unions. What would be much better is a high minimum wage, or what means higher, a minimum wage which is growing along the golden wage rule, or even more if you want to reduce the wage differential we have. The wage differential in Germany grew over, I think, since the 1990s. And this wasn't a good idea. It was promoted by the OECD. And today, the OECD says, wage differentials shouldn't be as large as they are today. So one could work on this and shrinken the wage differential by minimum wage growing above the golden wage rule, which has to be buffered by lower wage growth in the higher income groups, just to have a good average, an average which is accepted by the central bank. So if you have a good, or if you have a kind of confidence between the wage bargainers, or the outcome of the wage bargaining process on the one hand, and the central bankers who trust the trade unions that they wouldn't want to have higher wages in boom times, they will help to keep the interest rates low to fuel the investment process. So it's a kind of mutual confidence between both policy fields, the monetary field and the wage field on the other hand. And fiscal policy should fit in that, but I think more in a structural way, so that we can say we need more public goods, for example, in the health sector, or in what means the infrastructure, or in the educational sector. The UBI I would not prefer to have, but I would say, of course, our social benefits for those who haven't got a job and are not inside the unemployment insurance, it should be higher than it's today. So if you have the people with so little income that they can't take part in the society at all, this is unfair. This is not good for the society in a whole. But that doesn't mean a UBI for everyone who wants to, but only for those who can't get the job and a job and who are not in the unemployment insurance.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll just throw it out there that for posterity or for anybody watching this video later or watching it now, that I would say that you won't find anybody that truly gets MMT against basic income. You know, there are just macroeconomic problems with universal basic income that we're very happy to talk about at length. You know, so we're not hostile to, you know, people getting what they need to have a socially inclusive life. You know, so now, and in some ways, Friederike, what you just said addressed a question that came up quite a while ago from Utes Grundert, which was how can we overcome the large wage differences that exist, at least in Germany, between large parts of the export industry and the skilled craft trades of even social work? And so I wonder if there's any more to add or whether you covered that. Shall I just turn to you, Lachlan, and see whether you've got any comments on that point?
No, not on that one. I had a few. I've had a few points, thoughts on some of the other questions, but I might leave that for later.
Okay, all right. Let me just ask Oliver if there's any more to say on that point about overcoming large wage differences. Oliver.
Well, I can maybe say a sentence or two. I did a study of unit labor costs per sector for Germany once, and the interesting result of that was that essentially the Hartz reforms that have essentially established a huge low wage sector in Germany. It's for Western Europe, it's the second largest low wage sector after Great Britain, which was unseen before, right? Up until the 90s, early 2000s, Germany was, like, in terms of the size of its low wage sector, was an average economy. Like, it didn't have a very large low wage sector. And it was specifically with the Hartz reforms, a low wage sector was introduced because the bargaining power of workers was broken by damaging unemployment insurance so badly that everybody, you know, even workers in industries that are supposed to be more unionized and they're supposed to be stronger, and where the chance of unemployment is lower, were actually afraid to ask for higher wages. So how can you? And the interesting thing is that it's connected, right? So although industrial workers are usually well organized in unions, and so they should have a larger power to resist downward wage pressures. What happened was that if you lower wages in the part of the economy that is weakly organized, weakly unionized, then of course that also helps the export industry, because all the intermediate inputs, the intermediate products that come from the local, say even from the cleaning lady to the guy that sits there at night and watches out that nobody breaks into steals anything from the company. Like, if all the wages of these people go down, then of course that helps the export industry, and the industrial workers can maybe hold on to their wages a little bit more, but that in overall it leads to a strategy of wage restraint and lower wages. So in the end, if you want to overcome those large wage differentials, you have to strengthen the industries, the workers in those industries that don't have large union power, right? And a job guarantee can help with that. Obviously, also higher unemployment benefits can help with that. It increases your outside option. and as a result, you can ask for higher wages when you're actually talking to employers and trying to get employed.
Okay.
May I add something to this point of view?
Please.
I agree totally with Oliver, and I would say in Germany there's a kind of battle between trade unions, which are export-oriented on the one hand, and which are more relying on the inside demand, the internal demand here in Germany. So, for example, the Verdi trade union, so for the service sector, and it's in the interest of the employers to have this battle going on between the branches. And you have to teach the trade unions that they shouldn't give up a common view and a common battle again for higher wages. The export-oriented branches can always show if there are more jobs they are created in our sector, because they have this export surplus. And the service sector always has the problem. People are at the so-called marginal productivity line. What is the neoclassical view of the labor market? And they are very anxious to lose their jobs if the minimum wages is increased or whatever, or they are threatened with that. And also it doesn't happen. So when we introduced the minimum wage, we were told before by economists that this will cause about 1 or 2 million jobs. So we will lose jobs, and nothing happened like that. And if these economists were asked later on, we didn't see any job losses. What did you predict, and why was your prediction wrong? They said, yes, that's right, but the business cycle was going up. And nobody asked, was this probably because we had a minimum wage and higher wages? So this is so ridiculous that the demand problem behind wages and the question how we distribute what we produce isn't asked anymore. So when I make this point, I'm often characterized as a dinosaur back in the 1970s. But this is what economy is all about, how we pay work. This is very, very simple. And we have to distribute the productivity gains in the broad, in the mass of people, of the employees. If we don't do that, they don't give what they can give, these productivity gains. So you have them only not potential, but you have to they can realize if you reflect them in the wages. And if we don't stick to this rule, it's not important whether this rule is old or not. It's true. So if we don't stick to this rule, we will never get out of the unemployment. In all over Europe and also in Germany, it's only hidden unemployment if we have this large low wage sector. And involuntary part-time and whatever we all have in this country, in this rich country. Yes, we have so many people who are near the or who feel poor, and we have this large inequality. We were always told that the inequality is a good motor, fuels investment, and just the opposite is correct. We have lowered the taxes on capital, and we have low wage growth, and the outcome is that we have no private investment, no dynamic in private investments, and therefore we have problems on the labor market. And it's just the other way around. We are told since 3 decades. The neoclassical view is deeply rooted in the conscience not only of the employers and politicians, but widespread in the employees' minds. And this is a problem, because then they don't fight for their fair share, and not only fair share, but for the share which is systematically necessary for the economy to function. And this is, I think, this is the main problem. We have to go back to the roots, that we say work is what all economy is about. Work and how it is paid.
Yeah. Great. So Lachlan, you had but I'm getting a little echo in my. Okay, Lachlan, you said you'd seen some things in the comments that you wanted to respond to.
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, I just have to absolutely endorse everything Friederike just said, and point out, for instance, in Australia over the last decade or so, productivity has grown cumulatively by about 10%. Wages haven't grown by anywhere near that amount. So absolutely, it is a distributional question. It's one of the reasons why a tight labour market is necessary, but not just a tight labour market, but also strong labour market regulations. It's not just enough to have, and I mean, I'm studying at a mainstream university, and we get an econometric model of wage growth that says wage growth is a product of workers' skills, education, experience, and I have to bite my tongue and stop myself from saying to my professor, no, that's a potential model of productivity. You're just assuming that productivity and wages are the same. And in fact, the line it's in the introductory econometrics textbook. We're looking at this semester. Economists in laying out the model of wage growth. We assume that wages grow commensurate to productivity. It is literally, but sorry, I'm not actually doing it justice. It's stated as fact that wages grow commensurate to productivity, and we know that that is not the case. Australia is an empirical example of why that is not the case, and that's a distributional question, and it's a question around the bargaining power of workers and their trade unions in the market. I just quickly wanted, in terms of those other issues, and Christian, you alluded to the importance of the union design, the involvement of unions in the design of the job guarantee, and that's partly a political necessity in Australia. Because, and I'm cautious here, because I do work full time as a civil servant, so I'm not able to make political partisan remarks. And in fact, the bar earlier, I think, said that I was from the Australian Treasury. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I should say at this point that nothing I say tonight is should be taken as representative of the views of the Australian government, etc., etc., etc. I'm just appearing as an economics master student, etc. It's a political necessity that the union movement be involved in the design of the job guarantee, because in Australia, the mainstream centre-left party, the Australian Labor Party, I think it's 50% of its conference of the delegates at its chief policymaking conference are elected by the trade union movement. Unlike, say, the US Democrats, the ALP in Australia is the parliamentary arm, as it is in a lot of European countries, obviously. It's the parliamentary arm of the union movement. You won't get a job guarantee in Australia if the unions don't support it, because the centre-left party of government will not support it. Now, I live in the Australian Capital Territory, which is sort of our equivalent, I guess, of Washington, DC. And in 2019, the ACT branch of the Labor Party passed a job guarantee. It was designed by a number of us who are members of the union, myself and a public sector union organizer, a number of others. And just to address some of the issues that were raised in the comments, we started out essentially from a sort of classic MMT model of the job guarantee, but we made a number of adjustments that were partly necessary because we recognise the industrial landscape reality that our union faces, and partly actually in response to some of the issues that have been raised in the chat. So, for instance, our proposal involved recognising different tiers of skill and responsibility and paying accordingly in line with a union negotiated industry index, such as, for instance, the work level standards within the Australian public service or equivalent rates of industry. It would include appropriate measures to encourage union membership. Now, I mean, Bill Mitchell is one of the most pro-union people I've ever met. He's done more pro bono work for the Australian union movement than I've had hot meals. In developing such a scheme, ACT Labor committed that the union negotiated, I'm just reading from the motion at this point, that the union negotiated industry index will not undermine existing workers' pay rates or conditions and must be included within work health and safety and workers' compensation schemes. And the final point that we put in was that job guarantee workers should receive the same conditions as someone with a union doing the same work. Now, the reason for doing so, and I'm conscious of, I know Bill didn't agree with elements of this. I know Martin Watts didn't agree with certain elements of this. I'm conscious of what Warren Mosler has said about, you don't want to create a sort of a situation where the job guarantee bleeds into a whole bunch of things. That's all true, but the reason we put those conditions there is so that the job guarantee could not be used as a cheap alternative pool of labour. If you wanted, those provisions were put in that particular motion. So if, for instance, if you wanted to put a job guarantee worker into, say, a call centre fielding calls from unemployed workers as part of the Australian social security system, those workers will be on a higher rate of pay that's been negotiated by the union. If you want to put a job guarantee worker into that spot, you automatically have to pay them at the rate that you would pay for a permanent public sector worker. So in other words, you eliminate the discounted wage. You eliminate the incentive to do that. I should say the other component is for a lot of unions in Australia, I think there are issues around the idea of the job guarantee wage being set independently by government, by a regulator. For the reason in particular our union has an issue with it is because we don't want a separate pool of public sector workers created who don't have the right to negotiate or bargain for their wage. Their wage is set essentially by decree by a regulator. We would say, no, our members have an industrial right to negotiate for their wage. We'd argue that wage, for instance, should be pegged to the sort of entry-level union negotiated wages. The argument then goes, oh, well, then surely that would be inflationary. And here it's important to be cognizant of some Australian history of political economy. In the early 1980s, in response to the stagflation of the 1970s, and stagflation in Australia had produced massive wage price spirals as it did elsewhere. The union movement in Australia under the Australian Council of Trade Unions actually formed a formal pact with the Australian Labor Party, which came to be known as the Prices and Incomes Accord, which was essentially an incomes policy. A formal agreement between the union movement and the federal Labor government that essentially accepted nominal wage restraint on the part of the union movement in return for what was termed the social wage from the Labor government. That is increased investment in health and education, retirement incomes, and things like that. Now, there have been critics from, say, the Marxist left that said that was a capitulation. It was loathed by the political right at the time as an example of the unions and Labor governments working together too well or too closely. And there are various critiques to be made. But the point is that institutionally, trade unions can actually negotiate inflation-responsible macroeconomic policies. And so, for instance, we would have a real issue with the argument that, say, a union-negotiated job guarantee wage will be inflationary, because the history, if anything, the critiques of the union movement in Australia from the left have been that they've been too hawkish on inflation and gave too much away to the inflation hawks with their income policies in the 80s and 90s. But institutionally, it can be done.
Okay. Yeah, that seems pretty clear. So we're going to be...
May I add to this? I agree with Lachlan. I would say we have a problem to address the goal and the instrument. So if normally the trade unions or the bargainers for the wages are seen to be responsible for the unemployment rate or for the employment rate, and the monetary policy seems to be responsible for the inflation rate, but it's just the other way around. So the labor side is more or less controlling the inflation rate, because inflation follows the unit labor cost, and the monetary policy controls the interest rate, and by the interest rate, the growth rate for production, so in the investment process, and that means the employment development on the labor market. So the instrument is or the success of the monetary policy is measured in a way what the monetary policy can't control. So both fields have to work together, and if they do that, this was what Lachlan was describing. If this functions, we have much less problems, but we have to see this interference of both fields. Yes, that the instrument of the one says how successful the other field will be. And if we understand this cross responsibility, we just better understand how the economy works and how we have to get to better welfare in the whole country or in different countries. Yes. Okay.
Thank you for that comment. So we're in the last 10 minutes of our panel here. So this might be the last question. I know that Oliver, you were looking at addressing some things that were coming up in the chat, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. But if the other two could think about any closing remarks after we've done this, if there's any time. But this might be the last. This might be the last question we get to talk about. So, Oliver, I'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Mark had a question in the chat. Has anyone explored the specifics of how a job guarantee might work using real-world detailed examples, possible scenarios? There's actually a lot of work on that, both theoretical and practical studies of how programs that are inspired by job guarantees or come somewhat close to job guarantees have worked in the past. I mean, some answers have been given in chat, but theoretically, like there are good studies about the US and Greece. You'll find them at the Levy Institute. And in practical terms, I think there's been a revival of job guarantee ideas through unions in Europe. You'll see this in Austria, you'll see it in Germany, but it has expressed itself in terms of programs for the long-term unemployed. So in Germany, you have a program where they'll try to give a job to people that have been in unemployment for over 6 years, and they're recognizing how they will not find a job in the private labor market. Let's give them a public job, and that program is sizable. They're not going to provide a job to everybody that fulfills that criterion, but to a lot of people, and they'll study how it works. And it's kind of a job guarantee for the long-term unemployment, if you give it the benefit of the doubt and the best of interpretations. And you have similar programs in Austria. We'll have a pilot program that is actually going to be studied by some top economists of a very small region, where they try to give a job to every person that is unemployed for over a year. And the people are responding surprisingly well. Everybody takes that job. Like there's few quits. There's few people that actually leave the job during the tenure of this program. So I think that can be a starting point if we talk about how do we get job guarantee programs into the public discourse. We can use these programs, expand them to more and more long-term unemployed people who don't have many outside options anyways, right? The private sector doesn't want them, or the economic upswing has not been large enough so that they are wanted by the private sector. But just to make a very last point that I think is still an open question, also in terms of what Lachlan said, I found it interesting that the Austrian unions have the very same thoughts and reservations as the Australian unions when it comes to a job guarantee. They essentially want to make sure that the jobs created in the public sector are paid according to the collective bargaining agreements and not at the wage floor or at the minimum wage that the job guarantee sets, right? And I think that's still a bit of an open question. What does that mean macroeconomically? And does that work if we extend the job guarantee not only to a set of long-term unemployed people that obviously have limited outside options? There, it doesn't matter, right? But what does it mean if we extend this principle to a universal job guarantee that everybody can take up? Because in the job guarantee theory, like once you have an upswing, once you have the economy is entering good times, right? The job guarantee theorists always make the point, now is the time that people switch from the public sector employment at the minimum wage to a better paying private sector employment, private sector job, right? But if they're in the public sector with a quite a good collectively bargained wage, where's the incentive to switch to the private sector? And I think this is a point that's still a bit that needs to be discussed. How do you implement the job guarantee so that you still have this mechanism intact, or is it not that important? Or there's I think that's a bit of an open question here that that needs to be resolved before we can go into implementing job guarantee programs with the help of unions. And like you said, Lachlan, unions and their political parties are the only way that we will actually get job guarantee programs on a larger scale. But I think this question needs to be resolved before we can go in that direction. But yeah, the positive thing is that we're not there yet, right? Like we're still at the stage where we have to actually expand the small trials of job guarantee programs for the long-term unemployed, at least from an Austrian, German point of view, to broader sets of the long-term unemployed, maybe even everyone, before we can then go for all the unemployed and even some of the employed people, right? So that's a bit it's some food for thought at the end of the discussion.
Thank you, Oliver. And speaking of food for thought, we have 4 minutes left, and so any closing remarks, Friederike?
Yes, thank you very much again. I think we should take into account that employers in Germany are already complaining they had a lack of qualified workers. So the job guarantee looks like, I would agree that we have to distinguish whether these are long-term unemployed who has no chance to get another job, or whether these are people who fell out of their jobs because of, for example, the pandemic crisis now. If the employers on the one hand tell us that they have a lack of qualified workers, and on the other hand they don't want to pay good wages, I think there's a contradiction, and we should trade unions should just make this point during their wage bargaining process. And I want to add to the job guarantee a question that in my eyes, the state or the public jobs can't create the productivity growth we actually need. We also need for the Green New Deal. So I would say productivity development or the development of the economy lies more in the private sector. So we have to find means to force the private sector to go more productive. That does not mean to produce more cars or quicker cars, but to produce more green goods. Yes, you know what I mean. So we shouldn't rely on the job guarantee as a booster for good productivity development. It can be only a last caution, I would say, for a long-term unemployed. But this is not the way to get the economy, the structural changes we have to just to manage. We have to do it by the private sector. So we should force the private sector to get into action, and this will we will reach this if we have good wage outcome in the bargaining process, and if we have high taxes on profits, and only reinvested profits should be lower taxed. So we will force the enterprise sector to take its role like it has its role in the 1960s and 1970s. We should go back to this model and producing green goods.
Thank you for that, Friederike. So we're kind of out of time now. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to meet all of you. And it's just been a great discussion. And if anybody is interested in the job guarantee, I know in the chat people have talked about where has it been trialed, what studies have been done. Pavlina Chernova's website has a great FAQ section, and that's just off the top of my head. And also Dirk Entz wrote a paper about how to implement. He co-authored this with Pavlina about how to implement a Eurozone-wide job guarantee. But anyway, we're about to get cut off, I imagine. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to the three of you, and thanks for your participation. And the next panel starts in half an hour, I do believe, and that's on inequality, and that's a panel discussion with Randall Ray, Miriam Reim, Dorothea Schaefer, and Moritz Hofken. So stay tuned for that, and thank you also to the audience for the great questions, and lots of stimulating chat there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.